We're going to switch gears and we're going to start focusing upon each individual endocrine organ, what each of those endocrine organ releases, where it affects, and some pathological conditions that are related. So first and foremost, when we think about the structure of the endocrine system, we always start by looking at the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland through a little stalk known as the infundibulum. And within that stalk, we find certain vessels that will allow the hormones to transfer from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. But our entire endocrine system's action starts with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will always talk to the pituitary gland by releasing what are known as releasing hormones to the pituitary gland. Those releasing hormones will then indicate to the pituitary gland that it needs to release other hormones, and then those hormones will travel to any of the other endocrine organs that we have, such as the adrenal gland, or the thyroid gland, or the pineal gland. And those are just several examples. But whenever those hormones from the pituitary gland reach their other destinations, those will then tell each of those other endocrine organs that they will need to release their hormones. And that's how the endocrine system works. The pituitary gland for quite a long time was referred to as our body's master gland. But that was a bit of a misnomer because we did find out that the hypothalamus is actually what regulates the entire endocrine system. Now, the hypothalamus is considered part of the brain. It is found within a subregion of the brain known as the diencephalon, and then through the infundibulum, which is found here, connects the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland is separated into two portions, the anterior pituitary, which is here, and the posterior pituitary, which is found here. And we're going to see in subsequent slides what makes up each of these two parts of the pituitary gland and what hormones they release and what makes each of these two parts special. But the first thing that we're going to do is discuss the releasing hormones and the inhibiting hormones that come from the hypothalamus. So before we really jump into all of the different types of hormones, I just want to give you all a word of caution that we will be discussing many different types of hormones. Many of them will have different names, many of them have multiple names, and many of them do different things. So it can be very easy to get jumbled up with all of the hormones that we're going to deal with, but I suggest to you all that as we go through these, you either write these down on note cards or perhaps write these down on a list so that you can keep all of these together and organized. So first and foremost, these 7 hormones are the releasing hormones and the inhibiting hormones that come from the hypothalamus. All 7 of these will be secreted from the hypothalamus and affect certain cells that can be found inside of the anterior pituitary. And that's what these are here. I'll explain these in just a short while. And I'm going to start with the releasing hormones because these are the ones that we're going to really talk about the most. So I want to get started on these 5. So we have growth hormone releasing hormone. Its nice abbreviation. The rest of these are just as they sound. So we have thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, and gonadotropin releasing hormone. Each of these are appropriately abbreviated, as you can see in parentheses, and I would like you to know the abbreviations as they may appear in that way on your test. But you'll see that these are the releasing hormones. They are going to make their way down to the anterior pituitary and affect certain groups of cells. Each of them separately affects a certain group of cells. So you can see that these are somatotrophs. Somatotrophs is a group of cell that will eventually release growth hormone. And another place that we can see this is shown right here. So the hypothalamus will release its releasing and inhibiting hormones. They're going to travel down here to the anterior pituitary, and those hormones are going to affect individual groups of cells. So growth hormone releasing hormone is the hormone that tells our somatotrophs to release growth hormone. Well, thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, is going to go affect thyrotrophs, and corticotropin releasing hormone is going to go affect corticotrophs. Prolactin releasing hormone will affect lactotrophs. And lastly, gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to affect our gonadotrophs. So those are the 5 groups of cells that we see here. You can see our somatotrophs, thyrotrophs, gonadotrophs, our lactotrophs, and our corticotrophs. All 5 groups of those cells here can be found inside of the anterior pituitary, and they are releasing their hormones in response to these releasing hormones. So once again, just as was described on this slide in the last video, the hypothalamus is going to release releasing hormones to the anterior pituitary, and then the pituitary will release additional hormones out to any of the other endocrine organs, and that's how the endocrine system is going to function. Now we do have two inhibiting hormones, growth hormone inhibiting hormone and prolactin inhibiting hormone. As it sounds, growth hormone inhibiting hormone is going to go and inhibit the somatotrophs from releasing growth hormone. This also has the name somatostatin. And we'll see prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is also known as dopamine. We might be familiar with this chemical. Prolactin inhibiting hormone is going to affect the lactotrophs to prevent further release of prolactin. So those are our 7 hypothalamic hormones. 5 of them are releasing, 5 of them are inhibiting. All of the hypothalamic inhibiting and releasing hormones affect certain groups of cells in the anterior pituitary. Now, as I just mentioned, the pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus through what is known as the infundibulum. And the anterior and the posterior pituitary glands are made up of 2 different types of tissues. In fact, the anterior pituitary is made up of epithelial tissue, and the posterior pituitary is made up of neural tissue. Hopefully, we can easily recall epithelial versus nervous tissue from chapter 4. Because of these differences, we call the anterior pituitary the adenohypophysis, and we call the posterior pituitary the neurohypophysis. We have not yet discussed the secretory products of the pituitary gland specifically. All we've said so far is that the hypothalamus has its releasing and inhibiting hormones, and those will tell the pituitary gland what to release. I also mentioned that there is a blood vessel system known as the hypophyseal portal system, and that can be found here. This hypophyseal portal system is how those releasing and inhibiting hormones get from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary gland. So once again, we've seen this slide. We have these different groups of cells that are found in the anterior pituitary. We now know that those releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones are going to get to the pituitary through the hypophyseal portal system. But once those hormones get to the anterior pituitary, they're going to affect these cells to release additional hormones. And we saw on this slide that there's actually 7 anterior pituitary hormones, and there's 2 posterior pituitary hormones. Now, I'm only going to make you learn 6 of the 7 hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary. Those are growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, prolactin, and adrenocorticotropic hormone. As I am looking at this slide, I realized that there was a typo on one of my other slides. This growth hormone releasing hormone is actually not somatotropin. This actually gets the name somatocrinin. Somatotropin is more specifically growth hormone itself. So please make sure to write that down. Somatotropin is growth hormone, not growth hormone releasing hormone. Growth hormone with the name somatotropin is going to give us an indication that this hormone comes from somatotrophs. You can see thyroid stimulating hormone is also given the name thyrotropin. So thyrotropin is going to be coming from the thyrotrophs. And so hopefully you can see by now how these different groups of cells and these different hormones are really nicely named to help you keep all of these things in order. Now, these 2 are 2 that you might not have heard before and might seem a little bit more confusing, but follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are what are known as gonadotropic hormones, and therefore they will be released by the gonadotrophs in response to gonadotropin-releasing hormones. So FSH and LH will go and affect the gonads, and that's why they're called gonadotropic hormones. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as corticotropin, is released in response to corticotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And then we have prolactin, which will eventually go and affect the mammary glands. This will be released by the lactotrophs in response to prolactin-releasing hormone. Just FYI, there is also a melanocyte-stimulating hormone that I will not be requiring you to know, but if you look in your book, you will find that hormone listed there also. So these are the 6 hormones that come from the anterior pituitary, and again, they are released in response to the releasing hormone. So you can see these are really just listed again here on the next 2 slides. I am going to be using table 18.3 on your exam. So that is on page 633. But basically, that table is what is listed here on these two slides. You might get a little bit more information from the table, but anything I've highlighted in red is definitely important for your exam. So make sure you go and give this table a look. So just to go over these once more, growth hormone, also known as somatotropin, is released in response to growth hormone releasing hormone, also known as somatocrine. And its release is prevented by growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which is, in fact, given the name somatostatin. Thyroid stimulating hormone, which is also given the name thyrotropin. Thyrotropin is just the same name as thyroid stimulating hormone. They're the exact same hormone, just two different ways that we can refer to that hormone. So we've got thyrotropin releasing hormone. And this releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is going to stimulate thyroid stimulating hormone's release. And as you can assume by the name, thyroid stimulating hormone is going to directly go to the thyroid gland, and it's going to cause the release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland. You'll see that growth hormone inhibiting hormone will also prevent the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. The gonadotropic hormones, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone are both released in response to gonadotropin releasing hormones. So you can see both of those are our gonadotropic hormones. They're released by gonadotrophs, and they will eventually go and affect the testes and the ovaries. Prolactin was a special one. We have prolactin releasing hormone and prolactin inhibiting hormone. Now, dopamine is the same thing as prolactin inhibiting hormones. So PRH and PIH are the two releasing hormones that affect prolactin. And lastly here, for our purposes, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as corticotropin, will be released in response to corticotropin releasing hormone. And this is also another one, again, this melanocyte stimulating hormone, just for your information. This one I will not be testing you on. So this one will never be a right answer on any of my exams. Now, as we talked in the last video, most of our hormonal regulation is done by way of negative feedback loops. Negative feedback loops, the purpose of a negative feedback loop is to immediately restore a controlled condition back to normal. And that's what we see taking place in this slide. So we'll use corticotropin and corticotropin releasing hormone as an example for this slide. So that's what we're looking at here, is the negative feedback. We want to see how certain stimuli are eventually going to feed back on the endocrine organs that are releasing these hormones, and that negative feedback is going to prevent their further release. So you can see again, this is the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus will release corticotropin releasing hormone. That's going to go through the hypophyseal portal system down to the anterior pituitary, where we will then release corticotropin, which is also given the name adrenocorticotropic hormone. So corticotropin releasing hormone stimulated the release of corticotropin, and then when corticotropin gets released into the bloodstream, it's going to make its way all the way down to the adrenal gland, the adrenal cortex specifically of the adrenal gland, which I'll discuss whenever we get to the adrenal gland more. And truly, corticotropin just enters the entire bloodstream, so it's all over the blood, but this is going to be the only one of our endocrine organs that has target cells for corticotropin. So don't get that mixed up. It's not just going here, it's going everywhere in the bloodstream, but it's only causing its effect here at the adrenal cortex. So corticotropin is going to be released. It's going to hit the adrenal cortex, specifically this outer portion of the adrenal gland, and that's going to cause the release of an additional hormone known as cortisol. Now, we will see that many other hormones will come from the adrenal gland, but for this example, we're just going to use cortisol. When cortisol levels increase in the blood, that's going to feed back and tell the pituitary gland, as well as the hypothalamus, to stop releasing both corticotropin and corticotropin releasing hormone. So this is how our negative feedback is working. When we have too much cortisol, that's going to feed back and say to these two organs that our blood has enough. We have enough of this cortisol in our blood and we don't need any more. So this negative feedback is going to prevent further release of these two hormones. And much of our hormonal regulation works the exact same way. Negative feedback is major for hormonal regulation. And this is just one example to demonstrate that. Now, out of all the hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary, growth hormone is the one that is the most common out of all of them. We did discuss in the last video that all hormones are released in mini bursts. The greater the concentration in the blood that we need a particular hormone to be, the more frequent those bursts will be. So the human growth hormone, or growth hormone, as it will appear on your test, HGH is the same thing as growth hormone, so it will appear as growth hormone on your test. It is the most common of all of the anterior pituitary hormones that we have. Now, growth hormones regulation is also going to be by way of negative feedback. So let's go over this little process found here. So we've got growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone, two of our hypothalamic hormones. Those are going to get released from the hypothalamus. They're going to enter into the hypophyseal portal system and make their way down to the anterior pituitary gland, where they will stimulate somatotrophs to then release growth hormone. So this growth hormone then gets released into the bloodstream, and it starts to travel throughout the bloodstream. It gets pumped in the blood through the heart, all over the body. And once again, this is going to be in bursts. So we might release a lot of growth hormone, and then we're going to stop. And we're going to release a lot of growth hormone when those concentrations start going down. And the more hormone we need, we're going to release those in more frequent bursts. But eventually, we're going to have enough growth hormone. And that's when we're going to start to see this negative feedback taking place. So this growth hormone is eventually going to come out here and cause a whole bunch of other things to happen that are not so terribly important for us right now. But eventually what you can see is because there's more growth hormone released, that's going to allow this negative feedback to come and prevent the release of growth hormone and also to prevent the release of growth hormone releasing hormone. Now, at the same time that we are having this negative feedback from increased levels of growth hormone, we're also going to be stimulating the release of growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So this growth hormone inhibiting hormone, also known as somatostatin, is going to make its way down to the anterior pituitary, and that will in turn prevent the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. So there's negative feedback that we can see in many different examples of these endocrine organs, and this is just another example as well as the one that we just covered. So I mentioned that we want to be focusing on each of the individual endocrine organs, what hormones are released from that endocrine organ, what the effect of that hormone is at its target cells, and also the pathology related to those hormones. So these are going to be 3 examples of disorders that are related to growth hormone. Now, too much or too little growth hormone can stimulate either too much or too little growth. And on the next slides, we're going to go over each and every one of these hormones. But growth hormone, as it sounds, is going to stimulate our body's growth. We actually see on this slide that growth hormone is going to go to the liver and to the bones and the skeletal muscles and stimulate growth all throughout the body. So if we have an imbalance of the release of this hormone, too much or too little, that can lead to certain medical conditions as a result. So 3 examples that we have are gigantism, acromegaly, and dwarfism. And all of these are due in response to some type of imbalance of growth hormone. Now, gigantism and acromegaly are sort of 2 sides of the same coin. Gigantism is what happens when we have too much growth hormone release when we are a child. And if you can think back to ANP1, why would this matter? Why does it matter if we're a child or an adult for this? Well, when we're a child, we are still undergoing rapid and very profound growth. Most of our growth occurs when we're in adolescence. So if we have too much release when we are young, that's going to rapidly increase the amount of growth that we undergo. So one example are the growth plates that can be found in our long bones. The epiphyseal plate, where we're going to stack in new bone. We're going to be replacing the cartilage at that line. Well, that process of bone deposition in those areas is going to be seriously increased if we have too much release in growth hormone. So as a child, we end up with gigantism. And one example of this is this individual shown right here. And the first time I looked at this picture, I thought this was an adult and all of these were children. But if you look carefully, you'll see that these are normal-sized adults. And this here is a child, but these are normal-sized adults. And this individual is undergoing gigantism. So you can see that this individual is incredibly taller than everybody else, because he had too much release of growth hormone. Now, if we are an adult, if we obtain this growth hormone imbalance as an adult, that's where we're going to get acromegaly instead. Now, this is not going to cause a growth like this. You're not going to be this tall if you start to have too much release of growth hormone when you're an adult, because your growth plates will have already been fused. and there's not going to be as much growth going on in those places. However, certain areas are going to be affected with acromegaly, and one of the areas that we see is in the jawbone. The jawbone tends to get very, very rigid and pointed, and this individual is showing us what acromegaly is. We'll also see that acromegaly and gigantism will affect the hands, and you can see a normal-sized hand over here and a very enlarged hand due to the increased release in growth hormone. Now, those are two conditions that are caused by too much growth hormone release. However, we also can get pituitary dwarfism when we don't have enough release in growth hormone, and you can see that these individuals have pituitary dwarfism. So the three of these conditions all refer to imbalances in the release of growth hormone, and gigantism and acromegaly refer to the release of growth hormone, too much releasing growth hormone, at different times throughout life. And you'll see that two different sets of symptoms will manifest if you get these two different conditions. So the next three slides are going to characterize each of the anterior pituitary hormones, what their other names might be, and what their actions are. We'll see also the target tissues for each of these hormones, where they're going to go and what they're going to do when they get there. So first and foremost is growth hormone. Now there's quite a bit here in terms of the actions. I can understand that this might be seeming like quite a lot of stuff to learn here, and that's why I highlight some major points in red. That's going to be the thing that I definitely want you to know. I always recommend study what is highlighted in red first, and then start to look at the other things. So, growth hormone overall promotes growth. That's what growth hormones does, and that's why we name it growth hormone. It is going to go to the liver. It is going to go to our muscles, our bones, and cartilage. It's going to go all over our body. It's going to have a very far-reaching effect. Its main goal is to produce these little IGFs. These are known as insulin-like growth factors. And these IGFs are what are in turn going to cause the growth of our body tissues. So in essence, growth hormone is eventually going to stimulate body growth. Now, thyroid stimulating hormone, this one's also called thyrotropin. So thyrotropin, again, that's released because of thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So thyroid stimulating hormone, I prefer to call it this, because it's going to eventually go to the thyroid gland, and it's going to stimulate the release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland. Now, thyroid hormone is our body's major metabolic hormone. It's going to primarily control our body's metabolism. So you can see that thyroid stimulating hormone is going to synthesize and secrete thyroid hormone. And I guess a better way to say this is that it's going to prompt the synthesis and prompt the secretion of thyroid hormone. So basically, when the thyroid gland experiences thyroid stimulating hormone as it is affecting its target cells, that's going to stimulate the thyroid gland to do these things. Now, on this slide, we have our two gonadotropic hormones, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Both of these are going to affect the gonads, which are the testes in males and the ovaries in females. Now, follicle-stimulating hormone often stimulates growth of our reproductive cells. It's going to do a few other things, and we'll discuss some of those other actions when we get to the reproductive system. But what you can see here for the principal actions are that it's going to initiate the development of oocytes, which is the female egg cell, and it's also going to stimulate the production of sperm cells, which is the male reproductive cell. So follicle stimulating hormone stimulates growth of reproductive cells. It'd be a nice, easy one-line way to say that. Luteinizing hormone is going to work in conjunction with follicle stimulating hormone to cause other hormonal release. So you can see that luteinizing hormone is going to cause the release of estrogens and progesterone as well as testosterone. So all of those are other hormones that are going to be released in response to luteinizing hormone. And we will come to see, again, when we get to the reproductive system, that estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone are all going to be necessary for development. They're going to be necessary to aid in the process of these actions up here. So we're going to have luteinizing hormone also playing a major role. So these two work in conjunction. The follicle stimulating hormone directly affects the reproductive cells to grow and stimulates their own development. And luteinizing hormone is going to cause other hormones to be released that will aid in this process. We'll see that ovulation is another action that takes place due to luteinizing hormone. Again, this is going to be extremely important when we get to the reproductive system, but just some of the actions of FSH and LH. Now on this slide we see prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and the melanocyte-stimulating hormone. To simplify this, I will not be asking about the melanocyte-stimulating hormone, so you will not need to know this one. But these two are very important hormones that we need to be aware of. So prolactin is going to eventually affect the mammary glands, and this is going to stimulate milk production. So that's where we get the term lactation, from prolactin. And again, this has prolactin-releasing hormone and prolactin-inhibiting hormone. So that kind of tells you a little bit about the regulation of this hormone. And we'll also have adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, also referred to as corticotropin. So this is going to eventually go over to the adrenal gland, and it's going to cause the release of hormones from the adrenal cortex. Now, just so that you're aware, the adrenal gland has several different layers to it, and each layer releases different types of molecules. So the secretion of glucocorticoids is one of those molecules, and for now, this will be sufficient for our understanding. But when we get to the adrenal cortex, I will be elaborating on the chemicals that are going to be released from the adrenal cortex in response to adrenocorticotropic hormone. But what we see so far is still the same type of progression of events with the endocrine system. The hypothalamus releases releasing hormones that affect the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary then in turn sends other hormones out to affect these major endocrine glands to release their hormones and to cause their actions to take place. So as you study this, I would definitely like you to be aware of each of these hormones. I'd like you to know what their actions are and where it is that they primarily will affect. Now don't forget that there's also a posterior pituitary, and the posterior pituitary is going to have its own hormones that it releases. Now the posterior pituitary only has two hormones. Those are listed here. We have oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. And so both of those names are very, very high yield. I want you to know both of those. Vasopressin and antidiuretic hormone are the same thing. So we have oxytocin and vasopressin, which are the two hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary. Now, the anterior pituitary had all of those other types of cells, the somatotrophs and the lactotrophs and the gonadotrophs, and those cells synthesize their own hormones that they're going to be releasing. The posterior pituitary is a little bit different. The posterior pituitary does not make any of the hormones that it releases. Instead, it just stores those hormones and will eventually release them when they are ready. So the posterior pituitary works a little bit different than the anterior pituitary. So let's go over this. We have the neurosecretory cells found up in the hypothalamus. And this is just a group of cells, and they're going to be making those hormones for the posterior pituitary, oxytocin and vasopressin. So those are going to eventually make their way down and get stored in the posterior pituitary. And when ready, whenever our bodies are needing more of oxytocin or vasopressin, we're going to cause in the same way the release of those two different hormones. So this tract here, this tract is called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract because it includes the hypothalamus as well as this area through the infundibulum down to the posterior pituitary. So this is a nice little picture of the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. You can see these neurosecretory cells are going to synthesize these hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin. You can see the green dots are indicating ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin, and the purple dots is oxytocin. So these hormones are going to be carried in vesicles down the axons of the neurosecretory cells through the infundibulum and into the axon terminals that are found in the posterior pituitary. So this is where these hormones are going to be stored at. We're going to have oxytocin and vasopressin stored in these axon terminals. When just the right stimulus affects the hypothalamus, these vesicles are going to be released and exocytose their hormones into the bloodstream. So this is the major difference between the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. These hormones are not synthesized in the posterior pituitary, but the hormones in the anterior pituitary are. So when these two hormones make their way down to the axon terminals, they'll be released into the bloodstream and they'll be taken out to wherever their target tissues are. Now there are two major target tissues for oxytocin, the mother's uterus and the mother's breast. So we can see each of those indicated here. In the case of uterine distension during childbirth or the stimulation of the nipples during nursing, both of these things are going to cause the release of oxytocin. And oxytocin will then in turn go and cause these actions. So it's going to cause contraction of the uterine smooth muscle during childbirth. So this is going to be a very, very important hormone for stimulating and carrying out childbirth. This is actually going to be one of the few hormonal releases that is done by positive feedback. And in the second case that we have here, this is going to stimulate our myoepithelial cells, and that leads to the release of milk. So this is a very, very important hormone. And what's actually quite interesting about this one is its effect in non-pregnant hormones and in men is still being determined. So again, as with all hormones, I definitely want you to be comfortable with oxytocin, but you can especially focus on what is written in red. Now, our other hormone that comes from the posterior pituitary is vasopressin, also known as antidiuretic hormone. Now, antidiuretic hormone truly describes what this hormone's major action is going to be. So if blood pressure is up, if we're dehydrated, or we've lost a lot of blood volume because we're hemorrhaging or something of the sort, the neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus will release vasopressin. The major goal of antidiuretic hormone is to reduce water loss from the body, and this can be in the form of blood or in the form of urine. So a nice way to remember the action of antidiuretic hormone is by understanding what the word diuresis means. Diuresis means urine production. So antidiuretic hormone prevents the process of urine production. When we pull more water from the urine, we maintain that water in the body, and therefore we don't release as much urine, and water stays within our body. This is also called vasopressin because this stimulates blood vessels to constrict, which we'll learn quite a bit more about when we get to the cardiovascular system. But by constricting blood vessels, that's going to prevent and help stop loss of blood. So water is actually an antagonist to the antidiuretic hormone, and that's why when we drink a lot of water, that's going to increase our body's diuresis. We're going to increase urine production, and it will also be blocking antidiuretic hormone's action. So therefore, we'll be losing a lot of water in those cases. So the names antidiuretic hormone and vasopressin are both useful when talking about the mechanism of this particular hormone. So I'd like you to know both of the names for this one. So just in review, we have oxytocin and vasopressin that are released from the posterior pituitary gland. They are not made there, they are only stored in the posterior pituitary. So let's take a look real quickly here at the target tissues we see. We see the kidneys, the arterioles, and the sweat glands. We can imagine here that the antidiuretic hormone is going to go and affect the kidneys. The kidneys is going to be our major system for creating urine and releasing excess water from the body. So when antidiuretic hormone is released, it's going to go and affect the kidneys and basically tell the kidneys to not produce as much urine. And that's one way that we can prevent water loss from the body. We also see that antidiuretic hormone affects our sudoriferous glands, which are just also known as the sweat glands. So this is going to inhibit those from releasing more water and causing us to lose more water through sweat. And lastly here are the arterioles that we find in our bodies. The smooth muscle that is found in the arterioles is going to be constricting in response to this antidiuretic hormone. And this is in turn going to increase blood pressure. And if, in the case that we are bleeding profusely, the constriction of these blood vessels is going to help prevent more loss of blood. So these are the target tissues of antidiuretic hormone, which is our second hormone that's released from the posterior pituitary gland.